Welcome back, guys. Episode 2. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Todd Ulery.
And I'm Ian Douglas. And it was much better than last time. Thank you, Todd. Today we are talking about the magic car syndrome and how that's a pervasive issue in 1/32 scale and really just slot cars in general. And we're answering a viewer question from Rick Eichhoff from Florida. Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Victory's calling, it's racing time. The spinning thing takes the crown. Fast and furious, round and round.
Oh, God.
Rush, the speed's dominion. Welcome to the world of the spinning pinion.
Welcome back, guys. Episode 2. Thank you so much for joining us. If we haven't said it enough, thank you so much for all the support and all the comments on the first episode. We are absolutely blown away by the response. So thank you guys so much. We have a couple cool new things today. Today we are going to talk about our usual hot topic. We're also going to answer one of the first viewer questions that we got last week. And thirdly, we are going to tell you a little bit about how you could win this brand new Scale Auto NSX GT3 car. Just stay tuned. If you guys like what you are watching, please like and subscribe, comment below, tell us stuff, comment on our terrible haircut. Everything is all good. Todd, you'll never see his hair, so you'll never know.
Never.
But yeah, let's get into it. So Todd, what's our question today?
Well, our question today is
Our question. Yes.
We're covering magic car syndrome and how are the same cars not the same?
Okay. Well, that's a good one because I think there's a lot of magic car syndrome that goes around 1/32 scale racing.
So why don't we start by defining what we think or what we mean when we say magic car syndrome, right?
Okay.
Why don't you go first? What when you
Jesus, put me on the spot. You're just going to copy my answer. Okay. So I think for magic car, the idea is that you've built a couple cars. There's this one car that's just like miraculously somehow faster than all the others. You don't really know why it's faster, but you just know, you'll hear things like, well, don't touch that car. It's good. Don't touch it. Put it away. Put it in the box. Don't drive it. Or you'll hear people say things like, I built 6 cars and this is the only good one. That's kind of my impression.
Yeah, and to be clear, when there is a time and a place for the whole "don't touch a car," right, in race prep, like there is a place where that's what you should do is not touch a car. That time and place is not like months before the race, right? It's like it's in like the day before the race, or a couple of days before the race, maybe, where you don't really like tweak the setup. But there should not be in slot cars this idea of like a magic car that you put in the box and you never touch and you only bring it out, for the race, and you never tweak the setup, because once you, I think, understand what's going on with a car and how to set it up, how to set up cars consistently, you should know how to get a car back to that point. And if you don't, then that's hopefully what one of the things we're hoping to teach and show through this podcast, right, is how do you consistently get cars to the same point? How do you get cars to do what you want them to do and know how to get it back there? So basically that you're not just guessing, and when you come across a lucky combination, you're just putting it in the box and never touching it again. And that's what we mean by magic car, right? Is a car that you don't understand how you got it good, but it's good. And then you're going to just try to keep it, not ruin that and not spoil it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a time when, to your point, where you don't want to touch the car, right? Like if, let's say, it's a day before the race or an hour before the race, and you've been practicing with the same car with the same setup for, weeks on end, and what that car is going to do. Changing that setup at the last minute you're kind of playing with fire there, and that you don't know how it's going to react. And then there's other situations where, like at Electric Dreams, the track evolution will be so like extreme to where, we'll go down there Thursday and the track will be completely slick and then by Friday it'll be rubbered up, and then by Saturday it'll get cleaned, and then it will rubber up again. And so there's a lot of variance, but that's different than a magic car. That's different than like what we're saying about putting the car in the box. That's more about track evolution.
Yeah, and I think it's more right, like knowing when to lock your setup in. You talk about track evolution. So just speaking from experience at Electric Dreams, right? Like knowing that Saturday morning after they've cleaned the track is not the time to make setup changes is just a thing you learn going in there, right? The track's clean. It's not going to be like that by the time you race. Friday is the time to lock that in when the track's really rubbered in, right?
Yeah, like
And
even Friday
that's
afternoon,
not the same
right?
thing as a magic car, right? Like you're locking in a setup because that's the setup you want to race with when the track is in those same conditions. Like we said, what we're talking about is, basically not touching a car over, months and months between races or anything because you don't understand how to get the car back there. And that's what we mean when we say magic car syndrome. And that's, I think, one of the mysteries that we're hoping to kind of debunk or
Slot Mythbusters.
clarify throughout, throughout our episodes here, and hopefully we can get that to a point where it's not a mystery to everyone and there's not this magic car that people are afraid to touch and they understand how to get their cars back to that point.
So why do you think that people develop that perspective? I mean, I know you kind of touched on it, but what do you think originally created that sort of in people's mindsets? Because it's something that a lot of people have said, and it comes from different places. So obviously it's something that is sort of naturally, I think, created within the slot car racing community. Like, where do you think it comes from?
I mean, I think there's an element of it, right, that comes from just variance in manufacturing with plastic cars, right?
Yeah.
And I think you can get into kind of some maybe controversial viewpoints there as far as like what you should be able to do to a car in race prep. If you ask me my personal opinion, I think that you should be able to get chassis and motor pods and those parts in a consistent state, like to how they were intended to come out of the mold, right? And I think you could have two parts, let's say two chassis, two motor pods, and each combination of those might fit together a little bit differently based on how they came out of the molds. And that's one thing I think we should really normalize within slot cars, right? Is being able to account for that variability and make cars essentially the same across all of them. So we don't have this whole idea of like winning the chassis lottery or winning the, motor pod lottery, right? It's everyone should be able to get their parts the same. So we're not having this thing where we're buying like 10 of something just to get the one that's right or the one that's good.
Yeah. And that it's a really good segue, because I think that has happened a little bit in 124 scale, right? Where we moved away from rebuildable motors and we went to this sort of Chinese manufactured sealed can spec motor, and which is kind of great, but the quality control on it is really, really low, right? And so you might get a motor that has, it might be like a 10% variance. I don't totally know the number, but it will definitely be, you could get a really ballistic motor versus a really bad motor. And what I've heard people doing is they'll basically buy like 50 motors, right, to get that one good motor. And that defeats the entire purpose of having a spec motor. And so really, I think with 132, you're talking about the same thing where, I've personally had a situation where for like the NSR Western Championship at Electric Dreams, we were running red motor pods, and I tried one of the white motor pods, and it was literally like a millimeter shallower in all directions, and it had all this float, and then there'd be like a red pod that would just be like stuck in there, and it like wouldn't move at all. So even within the same company with different materials, there's different tolerances. It's kind of all over the place.
Well, and there's an element, right, of just variation in plastic manufacturing. How much does it shrink coming out of the molds? Did you remove it out of the molds right away, or did you wait and let it cool a little bit? Like, I think there's a lot of different things that can happen and why they don't come out the same? How long were they
Yeah.
sitting on the shelf? Um, I
And
think what we're getting at with that, right, is like understanding what is the original design intent and how to allow racers to get back to that point
yeah.
without, again, needing to buy a whole bunch of parts to find the two that are just this perfect magical combination.
Yeah. And I think to add to that, like, that's not to say that the manufacturers are doing anything wrong, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like these companies like Slotted, NSR, Thunderslot, all these companies, not so much Thunderslot, but like NSR, Slotted, some of these other companies, they're producing model race cars. And so for 90% of people, it's perfect, right?
Yeah.
And like what we're doing is we're taking it beyond what it was intended to do. And we're asking for a toy car company to produce something that has like tolerances as if it were, a Formula One car. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, you've got how much evolution that's happened in plastic cars in the last 20 years, right?
Yeah.
Because
10.
that was like when the first like motor pod cars came out, right? Like when Slotted first came out with the whole motor pod concept. And now you've got different materials that are coming into it. You look at a company like Scale Auto, and they use in their motor pods like a lot of the glass fiber
Yeah.
reinforced plastics, which shout out to Scale Auto. I think their pods are very consistent how
Yeah.
they come out
Super
of the mold
consistent.
because of that, and
Yeah.
they're dimensionally that they're all pretty much the same. You don't see that same level of variance that happens, and some of it's just like the design. Certain companies will account for that variability a little bit better in their design than others. Because you can have some, right, where it's like if you get a pod that and a motor and a chassis that are not that have like variance in the wrong direction for both of
Yeah.
them, right? Like they just like lock in, and it's like, why even
Yeah.
have a motor pod at that point, because it can't even move. Um, and that shouldn't, you should be able to account for that, I think.
I think so too.
Again, like, and again, like understanding how to get to that point, um, understanding where that line is, right, between like truly modifying something and really just getting something to where it was intended to be from the factory. I think is one of the elements in not having that magic car, right?
Yeah.
Understanding where the variance happens and how to account for it um, will really help you get consistency from car to car across, a whole fleet of slot cars.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just personally speaking, I've definitely had conversations with people who will remain nameless that they are concerned that scraping away and deburring and sanding a little bit of the pod is removing material, and that's illegal, right? And we've definitely had our fair share of comments about that. And I think that to your point, there is definitely a nuanced difference, right, between removing material and cleaning up what the manufacturer is not cleaning up. And I think
Yeah.
that it's subtle, but I think that you can tell when you know the car and kind of the tolerances that those cars come with. And
Yeah.
I think it's subtle, but I think there is a nuance there. I think there is a difference there between just like drilling out a hole and like gently, smoothing the edge of the chassis so that it doesn't bind. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So as far as like making sure that you can recreate the same car over and over again, do you have any tips that you can give sort of like newer people or even seasoned racers for ways that you approach building cars to get the same results over and over again?
I mean, the biggest one, right, is before you even start, let's say you have a car that you just pulled out of the box. I mean, when you and I are building cars, right, the first thing that we're going to do is literally take that entire thing apart. Like
Yes.
we're not, when we're building a car for a race, it's not like, oh, let me just do the minimum things that need to be changed out and let's throw it on the track. What I want to get
No.
that car down to at a very basic level at the start is a chassis and a pod, and how do those two parts interface,
Yep.
right? And one of the things that I use that is really helpful in that process are these like soft back sanding sticks. Let me see if I actually have one on my desk. I have like a 7,000 grit one, but like
Okay.
these Not in 7,000 grit. Like that's really for like polishing, but
Have fun with that, guys.
yeah, like a 400 grit or so. And the nice thing about that is you can really just kind of take that around the edges of the chassis. It's got a narrow side and a thick side, and just get that burr that comes off the flashing at the edge of the chassis, anywhere where the pod and the chassis are going to interface, or the chassis and the body, right? Like any movement between those three objects should be without any kind of hang up or anything, right?
Yeah.
And that's where you see most of the interference. And I think that's an easy one. You can also use like the scraping method. Like I like to use these chisel tipped
Yep, those are good.
X-Acto knives, and really just like actually scrape with it. And that does a good job too of like just peeling off kind of flashing. But the biggest thing, right, is like how does the pod fit in the opening on the chassis? And that's where that flashing will really get in the way of things moving the way they're intended to. And so that's the stuff you want to really pay attention to, is the flashing that's around that opening, and making sure that that's not interfering with pod movement the way that it can if there's excess of that.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying could be kind of applied to every part of the car, right? You take apart the car piece by piece, you reassemble it and blueprint it, and you pay attention to the small details. Where is this interfering with this, right? You're putting the front axle in, you're making sure it spins freely, you're making sure that all of your grub screws and everything are not bound up. Or sometimes you'll put the grub screw in and the chassis will actually like bend around it because there's too much tension. So just paying attention to those little details and making sure that you build every car the same, and then the result is the same for the most part, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of onerous, right? And I don't think every car ends up being that way once you really get the process down. But like really paying attention to how every step like impacts what you have assembled so far, right? So if you think of it from like an assembly standpoint, right? You've got the pod attached to the chassis. Everything you do at that point, then what is it doing to the car? So you mentioned grub screws. That's a big one, right? Like the front axle grub screws. A lot of times you'll build a car, it'll be flat, everything will be great, and you'll put those grub screws in, and all of a sudden the chassis is just drooped, right?
Yep.
And because you're pushing plastic out of the way, right? It's not like these are threaded holes, right? It's a hole that's drilled probably a little bit too small, and you put a grub screw in, and it's going to distort things. That plastic's got to go somewhere. And that one specifically, I can say like, heating up the screws sometimes with a heat gun before you put them in, for me, that's been really successful because I think it helps cut the threads a little bit. Like what?
I like to drink alcohol while I'm doing it. No, I use alcohol on the tip of the screw and I turn it in there, and it helps lubricate it, and then it evaporates.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's just an example, right, of like paying attention to some of those little things as you're assembling, because if you can nip that in the bud at that point and get it dealt with before the car is actually built and together, then when you're at the track trying to tune that car, it's so much easier to not have to be compensating, because everything that you do that introduces that is something you have to compensate for later, right?
Sure.
And so that's why I think this whole idea of Magic Car and really making sure that the parts are consistent before you start is huge, because it eliminates a lot of the frustration that I think people have when they get down the road later, where they think they're solving a tuning problem, but really it's an assembly problem. And you're never, you may end up figuring that out, but it's going to be a frustrating road to get to that point.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's 2 points that I take away from that, which is that the quality of the components you use are critical. So always using, good gears, good axles, good wheels, all that stuff is super important to, again, achieving that similar result each time. Like a lot of the time, the gears that come with the cars are just these sort of throwaway gears. We don't even use them. We just literally throw them away, put in Slotting Plus gears. Shout out to Slotting Plus. Email us about sponsoring our podcast. But those gears, like the Slotting Plus gears, I've had one bad one, and I couldn't really even find what was bad about it. It just made a sort of a weird textury noise. But other than that, every single one that I've had has been dead on. I don't know if you've had a similar experience.
Yeah, I mean, like when I first used those gears, I remember asking Mark Natividad at Electric Dreams, I was like, has anyone used these yet? Because at that point they had them in stock. No one had really tried them. He's like, no, not that I can remember. And I just tried them because I knew they made good stuff. I knew they had stuff that I liked. They made really good screws. They made really good, just kind of peripheral parts for the cars. Um, and this is kind of before I had any interaction with Miguel at Slotting Plus.
Yeah.
But um, I remember putting those on a car. This is like maybe my third race. The car was so quiet that it was almost a problem how quiet it was because the gear mesh
Yeah.
was just good, you know? And it was like, oh, I don't have that auditory feedback now of hearing, the gear whine, which is, almost an issue for a while until I got used to it. But yeah, I mean, to the point though, is really just making sure that you're picking the parts that you know are going to be good. Um, and I think as you go through it, I mean, it's hard for us to like on a podcast like this, we're not going to sit and probably shout out like the manufacturers that maybe don't make certain parts the best, but um,
Or,
axles are a big one. And I think for axles like NSR, Scale Auto, Slotting Plus, like those, to me, if I'm going to put an axle, those are the three companies I think of that I'm going to pick that generally are straight. Um, and I check mine, but I don't think that everyone, that's probably a little too far for most people, but,
Yeah.
um, just
Well,
using parts that are quality and good, and that gets you to the end point, where you're not chasing again parts issues or assembly issues. You're really just tuning the car
yeah.
once you
And I
get
think
to the
that
track.
that brings up that kind of like bigger question is, you know, is that um is that amount of work, I don't want to say worth it, but like, is it too much work, right? And I think that again, we'll cover this in another episode, but I think that at the end of the day, it is still car racing. You know what I mean? And anything you can do to, build a better car, I think as a racer, you're going to want to do that. That's my natural inclination, is always to just look at the rules, look at how we can build a faster car. And to me, that's part of the joy for me, is is the problem solving, right? Is figuring out how to make the car faster within the confines of the rules, how to make it perform better. And to me, that's part of my joy in the hobby. I know that's not everyone's, but maybe you can speak to that for you.
Well, and I think, for me, obviously that's part of the hobby I enjoy. I think I've gained a reputation a little bit as a builder, but it's,
It's not your only
I think
reputation.
one of the one of the things that in competitive racing that we maybe need to get away from a little bit is this concept of like out of the box, right? Um, and I know that
Yeah.
there are clubs that enjoy doing that. I mean, shout out to Stephen Farr Jones and the Far Out Club, and they
Big shout
have,
out.
a lot of success doing that. And their races are a ton of fun. I wish I could attend them more. I just don't have time.
Excuse
And
alert, excuse alert.
but I think, for when you're talking about competitive racing, like the racing that happens at Electric Dreams and a lot of clubs,
and Motown.
and Motown. Shout out to Motown. This idea of taking a car out of the box and just kind of tweaking it a bit and racing it, I think is one that lends a little bit to that whole concept of magic car, right?
It does. Totally.
And
Exactly
I
what I
think
was going to say.
people will have actually a lot fewer headaches if you start to think of it as that's just an assemblage of parts that you then are going to take down to its core and build
Yeah.
back up. And the things that we're talking about, there's probably, it's an 80-20 problem, right? Where we might do the 20 that, that we probably don't really need to do
What are you talking about?
of getting a
Never
car,
done.
like
I've never done
I
too
might
much.
break the edges with 400 and then go back over it to get them even, like better with a higher grit. But like,
I've
you
never
don't
putty
need to do
balanced a
that.
wheel.
Yeah.
Never.
But I think the thing is there's a balance there, right? And, as much as these concepts maybe at first seem like a lot of time to put into a car, when
Yeah.
you've done it a few times, it's really not. Like prepping a chassis and a pod to get ready to assemble it is not something that should take a lot of time. It's just getting it to that point, realizing that maybe you should take the car apart at first and get down to those elements and make sure that they interface well together. And then stepping forward from there. And you really have to consider, right? Like, is that time you want to spend there, or is that time you want to spend at the track in frustration because you don't
Yeah.
know, what's causing an issue per se? And really, then at that point, you aren't as intimately familiar with the car to know how to address that problem, or when it's not something that's a tuning issue, that's actually a parts issue.
I dare say that there is really no such thing as a magic car, that it's just bad cars. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
almost like the magic car is just the one that came out the way that it was supposed to, that it was intended to, and then
Yeah.
everything else is just crappy tolerances, But we could talk about this for a long time. We got another question, reader's question, our first reader's question.
That's
Do
right.
you want to tell us a little bit about who that's from and what the question is?
Sure. So our first reader's question is from Rick Eichhoff.
Rick
Of both Pennsylvania and Florida now, right? I
He's a
think
big deal.
he just built a new track at his home in Florida that from the initial pictures is very nice looking. And he
Yeah.
asked us, said, would very much like to hear your viewpoints on magnetic braid tracks versus the non-magnetic braid tracks. How was the new rebraided Cunningham track, and how has it changed your car tuning? So for those that don't know, the track at Electric Dreams, the Cunningham 132 wood track, used to be Magna Braid, and Bob Scott over the month of January rebraided that track, recut the recess, and put in non-magnetic braid. So
And that was because the braid was also having some issues, right?
yeah, it wasn't strictly an issue with Magna Braid. The braid had been on the track for 2 or 3 years at that point, and really when Electric Dreams was doing that to begin with, right? It was something that not a lot of people had done, especially in a
Yeah.
commercial setting, of making a 132 specific track, and the choices that went into that, right? So,
Yeah, it was
the braid used to
100%
be
built.
very flush, and that caused issues, right? Where the braid would get rolled up, and I think that kind of got it to that point of needing to have that replacement done. So as far as the tuning difference goes, I think for
Let's
you
talk about our
Go ahead.
opinion first. That's our
Sure.
opinion. That's the spicy part.
All
So
right.
what do you think about magnetic braid versus non-magnetic braid?
I was a big fan of going to non-magnetic braid. As much as I've enjoyed certain cars, think like my Scale Auto LMP that had a neo magnet motor in it, which
Track
had,
holder.
a lot of ultimate track holder.
Great white track holder.
That car was a lot of fun to drive. It didn't drive purely like a magnet car. It didn't have magnet cars level of magnetism, but it had somewhere in between. And I think there's something to be said about that. But my opinion, as far as like the Magna Braid versus non, is I think Magna Braid was potentially masking issues with some cars that people weren't realizing until the car was at its limit and off the magnetic braid, right? And then it just makes it harder to intuitively understand what the car is doing, and B, actually know like what's the problem? What do I need to fix? Why is this car suddenly really bad when it's at its limit? And it might be that the car had something wrong with it all the time. The magnetism was just masking that until it got off that track. So what was your opinion between the two?
Okay, so I'm kind of torn because the racer in me says ramp up the challenge. I want more challenge, take away all the driving aids, make it hard. I want to do it. But having driven both, I noticed that with the non-magnetic braid, it's a lot harder to be super consistent, because one of the things I really pride myself in is just like same lap time over and over and over and over again. And I noticed that at Scale Auto this year, it was really hard to do the same lap time over and over and over again. And obviously there were other variables there, like we had to run different guides, and the track conditions were evolving. But like, I think that for me, I like the non-magnetic braid, but part of me kind of misses the magnetic braid because the car just felt so good it just calmed the car down so much, and it made the car feel like it was on rails, obviously. But that like 20 or 30 grams of downforce just really allowed you to have a lot of like supreme confidence in the car. And now I think the car dances a little bit more. It's a little bit more prone to sliding here or whatever. And so you don't have as much confidence in the car, I think. I think that's kind of the difference for me.
Yeah, and I think it's still early, right? Like, it's a unique
Yeah.
surface, and like everything about that combination, I think, is unique, right? Like racing on a gloss epoxy surface with rubber tires that has never been spray glued. That might be the only place in the country that has that combo, right?
Maybe. Yeah.
And I think doing that without magnetism now, it's definitely a new challenge, a new yeah, new challenge. And I think,
Yep.
we weren't going to nail it perfectly in the first race. I think there was um, a shorter window of actually being able to test the cars before that I think
Yeah.
some of that can be overcome. And I think the big thing for me, one of the things that I didn't like about tuning cars for Magna Braid is that you really had to consider that,
Yeah.
right? Like you
Sure.
had to consider how low your motor sat and making sure that it sat as low as it could so that it was as close to the track as it could be. And particularly
Legally.
for, yeah, of course, but particularly for classes like GT. And I think specifically
Or scale
something
auto.
like the RT3 pod from Scale Auto, right, where
Yeah.
the motor actually sits like a half millimeter below the pod. And so, yeah, shout out to Scale Auto. But, I think that creates a situation then where you've got like a certain manufacturer, a certain pod that becomes almost like a requirement in a
Yeah.
class that should be very open, like GT, which has so many new models that have come out and so many manufacturers that have new models coming out. And it really kind of like condensed that down after I think everyone got more familiar with the Scale Auto cars. It was
Hmm.
like, last year, I think it was basically all Scale Auto cars for the most part in the final of GT right after the
Mm.
Scale Auto race
Interesting.
because it's so much more magnetism. Magnetism
Yeah.
is exponential for the distance, right? So, if that motor's hanging a half millimeter below, there's no way that any other car where it's flush is going to get close to that. And that element of tuning cars I really didn't care for. And I think I prefer now where we're tuning cars for the pure driving dynamics of the car.
Yeah.
Um, so
Well, in other forms of slot cars, the clearance rules, what's weird is that, like, at Electric Dreams, the clearance rule is that it only has to clear below the rear axle, which
yeah,
is different than pretty much anywhere else. Anywhere else, at least that I've gone, in my experience, it's been that the car must clear X clearance, either at the front of the car completely, at the back of the car, all the way around. There's like a minimum front clearance usually and a minimum rear clearance.
yeah,
So when I raced NorCal IMCA, we would race 032, which is like roughly zero point 0.8 millimeters now, in what we are doing. And you would get the tech tool and slide it all the way in, and so it would go underneath the motor. So for a magnetic track, it really, in a lot of ways, makes sense to enforce the clearance rule under the motor as well, which we never really did.
yeah. I think there's ways around it, right? Like if you have a Magnum Braid track, I don't think it's reasonable to expect, for someone that wants to have some consistency in a class like GT to say, oh, well, we have to rebraid the track now to be able to do that. No, I think, there are ways you can do it, like you said, with rules where have the clearance rule be under the motor.
Yeah.
Um, there are ways that you can make the RT3 pod have the motor be flush with just, a tiny bit of opening up the screw holes. And that, is a simple way to kind of create some parity between the different cars, across the class. So
Well, so
yeah, I
so
mean,
the
there's a way to do it, but
so the second part of Rick's question was, how does it change how we tune them? You mentioned that you prefer the process of tuning it just for all out handling dynamics. Like, how has it changed your approach to tuning?
so I think to put it pretty simply is just overall more weight quite a bit more weight. In fact, when I got the car to be where I felt it was good, and I was telling people how much weight I put in the car, every single one of them was absolutely floored because it was
Yeah.
something along the lines of like 15 grams, I think,
Oh my
13 or
God, you ran
15
that
grams in
you ran
total.
15
It,
grams?
maybe it was close
I
to
think it
that.
was like
Maybe it
10,
was like, yeah, I think it was more than
10 or
that.
11.
I'd have to go back and look. I
But
think it
it
was
was like
maybe like,
double. It was
it
like
was
double what
basically
year
double.
before.
And we were
Yeah.
already running like a fair amount of weight in them the year before because I think it was like 8 grams maybe the year before. But the other thing is that there was more weight shifted to the outside, right? To the pans because you don't have now the magnetism keeping the car from wanting to roll and traction roll and
Sure.
tip over. And so shifting the weight outside on the pans can kind of help with that. So that was really kind of the two things. The rest of it, the other thing is I did put a little bit of weight under the rear axle, which I never used to like on cars on the Magna Braid, but you and I talked about this before the race, and one of the things we kind of theorized is that because you no longer have the motor pulling down where the motor is located, and now your weight is typically in front of the motor, that the loss of that magnetic traction actually changed the front rear balance of the car.
Yeah, I think
And
so.
so it was only like 1 or 2 grams. It was a very little, relatively compared to the weight in the rest of the car, it was a small amount, but
Mhm.
just putting that small amount back there got the car to where it handled similarly to how it did driving on Magna Braid,
Yep.
just without obviously the magnetism. So the thing's holding it on in the turns.
Yep. And I'd say that like in years past with the magnetic braid, we just put the weight on the top of the pod. And we never really thought twice about it because there was so much. I mean, the scale auto motors, if you get them like depending on their clearance, they're like 80 to 100 grams of downforce, which is literally
Yeah.
the weight of the car. I mean, it's insane. Um, and this year we put the weight on the bottom, which I've never done. I kind of hate it because I think it's ugly. And as a
Yeah.
purist, I never want to put weight on the bottom of the car, but it is legal. So we did that to try to get the center of gravity down. What do you think that weight is doing on the bottom versus on the top?
I don't know that it's that big of a difference, to be perfectly honest. Because you have to use such a thin lead to get it on the bottom, I don't think it's that big of a deal, it being on the bottom of the chassis versus on the top.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a little bit of, honestly, we were kind of running out of places to put the weight. And so the fact that it could fit on the bottom and clear was good. One of the challenges that a few people had though, and I think this came up for um I know a few people's cars is, putting it where it's going to be over the braid at any point, you have to be really careful with, right? Because lead is conductive. And I think we resorted to putting packing tape over it so that that didn't happen. Yeah. So the big issue there, right, is if it comes in contact with the braid, it's going to short out. And we were having issues where people were actually blowing their controllers
Oh
because
yeah,
their
a couple
lead
true
was
speeds.
shorting out the track. And um,
Yep. Yeah, I
so
didn't love it. I
I
mean,
don't think it's I don't particularly like it either. I think it's, again, these are elements that I think are kind of unnecessary
yeah,
to tuning, where it's like if it's one less thing we have to worry about, I think it creates less things that you know racers across the whole of the field just have to think about. And
yeah,
they see us run it and they think, well, we have to put it on the bottom, when I can say
totally.
it's maybe like 1% or less of a difference than if you ran it inside the car. And for most people, and I really prefer it not to be a consideration for us, but for most people, I don't think it's really something that you have to view as like you have to do. Right.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of that where creative interpretation of the rules or unique parts. I think that it gets almost like a bit too much credit for what it's actually doing. It's really oftentimes it's like you said, the 1%, 2% at the most. But it's really, if you focus on those things, you're really missing the fundamental aspects of the car that are making it better.
Yeah, like the fundamental aspect of where is it placed front to back? Where is it placed side to side? And that's really the trick with ballast tuning. And we're going to do obviously some more in-depth stuff on this in later episodes, but the focus on where it's put top to bottom on top of the chassis or on the bottom is not the important part of ballast tuning. It's I literally think of it like a graph, X and Y, where forward and back, side to side, what are you trying to get the car to do? And we're going to have a whole episode on reading the car's body language and how to translate that to tweaks that you can do with your tuning. But I think that's the fewer elements you can have there, the better. So if you're asking me, I would say let's get rid of the tape on the bottom of the car, because I think it's just causing.
You mean the weight or the tape? That's another question.
The weight. Yeah. Well, not we don't allow tape across the motor pod of Electric Dreams, but yeah, I mean the lead tape.
Yeah, I gotcha. Well, and I think to sort of bring it back to Rick's original question, I think that the fundamentals of the car stayed almost identical. I mean, we built these scale auto cars pretty much identical to how we built them last year. Maybe with some slight refinements, right, based on what we learned. But really the biggest difference was just more ballast. And the interesting thing about that is that I then took that sort of mental shift and brought it to Modesto. And I found that this is also working really well for me at Modesto. So, the racer in me wants to always be on the limit of how light you can be. But then that's more conceptual. But like when you're driving the race and you're in the race and you want to push your car, having that little bit of extra weight is just so much more comfortable than driving on the limit and on the edge every single lap.
Yeah, because if you're driving at the limit of the car, and especially if you're driving at the limit of the car where the car's not communicating that it's at the limit, that's not a recipe for winning a race. You might get lucky every now and then win a race like that, but your results are going to be all over the place, because half the time you're going to, have a lot of mistakes, and those can kind of snowball, and half the time it's going to go perfectly and you might be really fast, but that's not how consistent races are won.
Yeah. You might even say that you should be able to win races at 90, 95%.
You might say that.
There's a topic for a different day. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you, Mr. Rick Eichhoff of Pennsylvania and Florida. We really appreciate your question. If you have a question you want to submit and you want to get answered, leave it in the comments below, or you can email us at thespinningpinion@gmail.com. And also keep an eye out for next episode. We are going to be giving away, like I said, this beautiful, brand new, in shrink wrap Scale Auto Acura NSX. So stay tuned next episode. Thank you guys so much. And what are we going to talk about on the next episode, Todd?
So the next episode, we're going to talk about what makes slot car racing enjoyable. And also we're going to answer a reader question from a one Eddie Shore, talking about how do we keep slot car racing from reaching the demise points that it has in the past.
Okay. And if we're doing anything that is currently contributing to that demise.
Yes.
It's our fault. It really is.
All our fault.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment. We love the interaction, and we're really excited to be on this journey with you guys. Just thank you so much. And this has been the Spinning Pinion Podcast, episode 2.
Hot takes.
Yeah. You've never done a hot take in your life. The spiciest thing to ever come out of your mouth is just a regurgitated chicken wing.